I'm Evan Smith, the CEO of the Texas Tribune. On behalf of my colleagues at the Trib, I want to welcome you to this year's Texas Tribune Festival. Every one of our 11 years in business, the work of our nonprofit newsroom has been critically important, but never more than in 2020. We produce reliable, credible reporting on issues that affect everyday Texans, making them better informed and motivating them to participate civically. You and people like you, readers, supporters, attendees at our events, make our public service journalism possible. If you've managed to make it this far into the festival without becoming a Tribune member, there's still time. Donate by September 30th at texastribune.org/give, and your gift will be triple matched by our friends at the Lowy Law Firm in Austin. Now on with the show. I hope you enjoy this conversation between former U.S. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Julián Castro, and Alicia Menendez, the host of MSNBC's American Voices.
Hey everyone, I'm Alicia Menendez, the host of MSNBC's American Voices. This session is being streamed as part of MSNBC's partnership with the Texas Tribune Festival, the all-you-can-stream virtual event happening all September long. Today, my guest is Julián Castro, the 2020 Democratic presidential candidate and former U.S. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. We're going to be talking about a number of topics. Secretary Castro, what a treat to have this much time with you, not the 6 minutes we're normally allotted in cable.
Yeah, no, it's great to be with you, Alicia. I agree. Yeah, this is a lot better than the 6 minutes or the 30-second sound bites that we often have to break that down into.
And I'm glad that we have this time because we actually haven't had a chance to talk in this capacity since you suspended your presidential campaign. And I had wondered, you traveled the country a lot during that time, and you spent a lot of that time with advocates on the ground in places like Nevada, where you and I spent some time together. And when you get to travel the country, you develop much more of a composite picture of where America is right now and what Americans are going through. And so I wonder for you, obviously, that period of time has changed tremendously given this pandemic, but what most stood out to you as you spoke and spent time with Americans across this country?
What most stood out to me is the reality of how people are living today in our country, and that it's true, this inequality gap that you see, growing inequality in our country. When you and I were together, we were there in Las Vegas, and I think you were following me for a story partly about these storm drainage tunnels that we were visiting in Las Vegas, where people live, people who are homeless, use these storm drainage tunnels, sleeping there on the concrete, on a wet ground. I visited in Las Vegas also with people who were going through a food line at that time. This was in 2019, and heard about the struggles that people are facing. Same thing when I was in Iowa and New Hampshire. So what I saw was that we certainly have many people in this country that are doing well. And America does have a lot to be proud of in terms of the middle class that has been created over the generations. But we also have a lot of people who are getting further and further behind. And this pandemic has shown us that group is actually getting larger, not smaller. And, I could see very much that reality last year.
There's this concept in public planning that I'm sure you're familiar with, which is resiliency, right? That so often we think about a city or a state going through something like a natural disaster, like a hurricane or an earthquake, and how this initial impetus is always to build things back to where they were. And there's this argument that instead you should build things to where you want them to be. You should use the setback as an opportunity to rebuild in a way that makes that city or that state more resilient. And I've been thinking about that framework a lot in the context of this pandemic, right? It is showing us so many cracks in our social safety net. It's showing us so many idiosyncrasies of our healthcare system. And of course, all of those things need to be addressed in a very immediate way. But there is also a rebuilding that's going to happen on the other side of this. And I wonder if you've had the time and the space to think about what things could look like, what systems and structures need to be addressed on the other side of this pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good approach, a good way to look at it. We do have an opportunity here. And that's one of the very few silver linings about what we've just been through. I'd say one silver lining is that we have an opportunity to come together more as a nation. And I think we can do that with leadership that is actually committed to bringing us together as a nation, because so many communities have been rocked by this pandemic economically, health wise, and so forth. But the other opportunity that we have is, as you say, to rebuild even stronger than before. And what does that look like? Well, it looks like making sure that everybody actually has health care. It looks like making sure that all of these essential workers, from farm workers to meatpacking plant workers, grocery store workers, fast food workers, healthcare workers that have been the ones who have stepped up during our time of greatest need as a country, are actually well compensated and provided good benefits, because many of them have not been for generations. I mean, farm workers are a great example of that. They've been working very hard out there. People probably saw the images a couple of weeks ago of those farm workers stooped over, picking crops, not only in the middle of a pandemic, but also as the fires raged across California behind them. The opportunity is to invest in the infrastructure that it's going to take so that people can actually reach their dreams in this country, instead of being stuck where they are and defined by the zip code that they're born into, or the station in life that they're born into. I mean, that was a notion that America, ostensibly rejected in the past, even though, there certainly we were not living up to our own ideals. There was a time when it felt like we had leadership that really was striving to make sure that there was economic mobility, that where you started didn't define where you're going to end up. And we need to get back to that.
I think back on so many of your policy positions during your presidential run, and it was one of the most progressive set of policy positions we saw in that race, which is saying a lot. And you set the pace on issues like immigration, on issues like police reform. Ideologically, is that where you started your political career? Because the fact that you started as a mayor, I think in some ways, we don't think of mayors as being particularly ideological, right? The job is to get it done. Is that where you started? And can you explain to me a bit of the evolution of where you started and where you've ended up?
I guess I would approach it going from the other direction. When you run for president, or if you ran for Congress, for instance, or Senate, you're asked to both opine on and put policies in place for issues that you don't necessarily have to grapple with in the same way when you're in local government. Whether it's immigration or a number of other issues. So if somebody looked at what I did as mayor of San Antonio, certainly I think they would have gotten a hint of what I believe. When for instance, when Arizona passed SB 1070 in 2010, I led a preemptive resolution to tell the state of Texas, the legislature, that we didn't want that in Texas, and didn't want it in San Antonio. We were leading on trying to embrace renewable energy and so forth. But it's fair to say that when I ran for president, people had an opportunity to see in full, what I believed on a range of issues. It's also fair to say, and you're right, that as mayor, the nature of the job is that you're focused much more on the practicalities, from infrastructure investment to code compliance to how the departments are working, and so yeah. But even then, the thing I'm most proud of was that we put before the voters of San Antonio an 1/8 of a cent sales tax increase, which they approved, to invest in high quality full day pre-K. Because I felt like it was not enough as a community for us just to get the basics right, that you had to direct your attention and your resources to actually creating opportunity for people that were getting left behind. So I think the seeds of that were there, but it's fair to say that not until I got to HUD and then especially ran for president that people really get to see my view on a whole range of other issues.
Can you talk to us though about how those ideas come together? Like, is there a party that has to sit down and actually think through these things, has to like sit down with a team and game out what that looks like? Because there are a lot of things you're not called upon to have an opinion on, and then suddenly it is really critically important that you do. I imagine that there's actually work that goes into that.
Yeah, I mean, there absolutely is. Any presidential candidate that tells you that they have the answers or know every little policy question that comes up is probably not telling the truth. Because when you're running for that office, you're dealing with um, everyday citizens that have questions and interest groups, frankly, that have questions. Some of them very detailed, some of them broad, many of them that, I'm familiar with, some that I wasn't. And so there absolutely was this process of both laying out a policy vision with the help of a team, and that team consulting particularly advocates and activists and interest groups, and using people across the country as a sounding board who understand these issues, academics, it's a whole range of people. And then, especially for me, and especially ahead of debates, making sure that I had a handle on the finer points of what we thought would come up in debates, for instance. So there was a lot to cover. I mean, it would that part of it was actually a fun part of it, because
I'm going to ask you. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, you get this sense of just the scope of issues. It also, not incidentally, made me question even more the fitness of Donald Trump for the office, because you can see very clearly, compared to presidents before him, that he just has no grasp of these issues. So many of the issues whatsoever.
I'm going to ask you one final question about your run, because I've been curious about this and we haven't had the time together, and then we'll move on. We'll talk about Texas, we'll talk about Latinos, but you're very mild mannered. I think most people read you that way. And then it was like a different person on that debate stage, where there was so much pep in your step. There was a lot of bite. And I think there were a lot of us who were like, who is this guy? And where has this guy been? Is that like your Sasha Fierce? Is there sort of a persona you step into, or is that who you are all the time and a lot of us just don't get the chance to see it?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think anybody walking out there, whether they're in politics or business or, whatever they're in, right? I mean, you want to make your point, and you do that within who you are. And so each of those things is who I am. I'm not, I've heard people say, oh yeah, you come off as kind of quiet. And yeah, I'm not the loudest person in the world. At the same time, like, I have a strong vision for the future of the country, and I know what I believe. So when the setting is a debate, then I know what I want to convey, and I know the points that I want to make. And so I think it's just a different setting, and so you address it according to the needs of that setting to make your point. But I can understand how people, thought, well, if they did not follow me all the time, because for the people that know me, that wouldn't have surprised them. But for folks that are not around me all the time, then perhaps that was a little bit surprising. Also, it doesn't help when there are like 9 other people on the debate stage, because you need to make sure you don't get lost in the shuffle, right? So
totally. I mean, in some ways, it's like there's a flattening of who you are, and I'm going to use that as a segue into the fact that you and I are called upon often as individuals, sometimes together, to talk about the Latino vote in this country, because that too, there's sort of a flattening effect that happens there, where, for example, right now, there's this entire conversation about how Joe Biden and Donald Trump are doing with Latinos. And it's really hard to have that conversation because we're not all starting with the same parameters. So the parameters I would start with are that any Republican candidate in a normal environment, whatever you consider a normal environment to be, would get about a quarter to a third of the Latino vote. That fact, even though it's historically backed, I think still surprises a lot of people, right? That a lot of people say, but his immigration policies, but the wall, but kids in cages. And it's like there is a segment of the Latino electorate for whom that is not mobilizing at all. And so I wonder how you explain that to people when they look at this electorate, which is deeply complex, not at all monolithic, how you capture why it is that there is a significant portion of these folks that are going to vote for Donald Trump.
Well, I think what that points to is that too oftentimes the perception that, let's say, quote unquote, mainstream America has of Latinos and Latinas is one dimensional. And it's one dimensional because for generations, the community has been one dimensionalized by mainstream media. And that one dimensionalization is everybody got here 5 minutes ago. Everybody speaks Spanish fluently, and that's their first language. That everybody is a Democrat, and that immigration is the top concern of every single Latino. Oh, and also that Latinos only work in low-wage jobs. Like basically, go pull somebody out of one of these states. There aren't a lot of Latinos, and even some of them where there are. And these are the stereotypes. This is the one dimensionalization that you get of the community. Whereas we know that the reality is it's a diverse community. You have people of different national origins. You have people who have been here for 12 generations and people who have been here for 12 days. And both of those groups are working very hard and contributing to the forward progress of our country. And it's also true that there are some divergent political views that you do have, baked in, as you said, 25, 30, sometimes a little bit more than that percent that have tended to vote Republican, especially in states like Florida and in my home state of Texas for different reasons, different histories. But that is there. And so people should not be surprised. And in this election, they should not give Donald Trump a lot of credit for polling, at 26 or 27 or whatever he is, and then having a little bit of undecided right now. That's not a revelation. It has been like that for a while. I just hope that in the years to come, as we see everything from the diversification of the faces that deliver and prepare our news to the stories that are told by Hollywood and publishing companies, that people are going to, and also in our history books and classes across the country, that people are actually going to see the Latino community in its fullness, or at least get a better understanding of how diverse it is. That's my hope.
There is, especially if you look at the polling in this cycle, a big gender gap between Latinas and Latinos, that like some of the movement we've seen among this electorate to Donald Trump has come from young men. And then on the other side of that, there is no one more fired up about Donald Trump than Latinas. And there's a gap. I mean, in as much as Joe Biden has room for persuasion among Latinas, there's also just a lot of room to turn them out. We know that it's a demographic that tends to turn out at 14 to 20 points less than non-Latina, Black, and white women. I wonder if you have any sense of what that gender gap is about, and specifically why you have young Latinos, like you said, in your state of Texas, looking at Donald Trump as a viable option.
I can't say that I have any special insight into that. I would start off by saying, as you know, that there's a gender gap generally among every racial and ethnic group that I've seen, at least in the tabs of these polls. So in the crosstabs, that gender gap applies to everybody. With regard to the Latino community specifically, you have among Latino males, oftentimes in places like my home state of Texas, a fairly strong affinity for the military, many folks who are religious, just these different elements of people's experience that if we look at
complicates the picture.
What people tend to do, they tend to lean a little bit more conservative, and you have Latinos that fit the bill like that.
I was in Texas, I guess, over a year ago following the Jessica Cisneros choir race. And so I spent a lot of time in RGV, and I was talking with our mutual friend, Cristela Alonso, about the fact that, I grew up in Union City, New Jersey. Union City, New Jersey is one of the most densest populated cities in the United States. We all live on top of each other. And it was so startling to me being in the Valley, because I was reminded that people live so far away, that being in community takes on a completely different nature. And I've thought about that a lot as we've been having this conversation about whether or not Texas can actually turn blue, which is to say that it is a huge state. So it has a parallel to the conversation we're just having about the Latino electorate. And there are a lot of places where, the way in which you campaign and the way in which you engage with voters is just fundamentally different than my sort of the experience I have had of engaging with those communities. And so I wonder, from your vantage point, we've heard a lot about Texas turning blue. I feel like it's one of those things like you hear every cycle, but then every cycle people are like, no, this time we mean it. So if you were a betting man, I know you are not. I know you actually go to Vegas and don't gamble. Would you place your bets on turning Texas blue?
I gamble a little bit, Alicia, a little bit. Except when I was at HUD, I didn't want to go pop a quarter into the slot machine because I didn't want somebody to tweet out, "This is how you're spending your money." But then I saw that Donald Trump's not paying any taxes, and I said, "Geez,
you could upgrade to the quarter machines."
Yeah. So that dynamic that you pointed out, by the way, on how spaced out people are physically, geographically in Texas. No, I mean, that's still true. Texas is a less dense state than somewhere like New Jersey, or certainly most of New York. And the impact of that has been, at least in the last 50 years, that has, helped it trend more conservative, more Republican. However, I do think that 2020 is different. And what I would point to are two things. First, that here in Texas, we've had a lot of growth in the state over the last 20 years, maybe even longer than that. People that have been coming into the state that generally have had more moderate views, people moving in from whether it's Arizona, California, Florida, a number of places, that have been moderating the state. And you see that in the suburbs of Dallas, Houston, Austin, San Antonio. And then secondly, the demographic changes that everybody always writes about and talks about on TV, which is to say the growth of the Latino community, and also the growth of the Asian American community that really has not received as much attention, but it should, because it has helped propel counties like Fort Bend County that Tom DeLay used to represent, which is right adjacent to Harris County, totally suburban, but now very diverse, including a lot of Indian Americans. Those two factors are coming together in 2020. And just today, we saw another poll, 48-48, Biden and Trump. And so I tend to believe that this cycle, it is a very close race here in Texas. And I think that Biden can prevail. We're only 9 seats away from taking back the Texas House. That would be fantastic right before redistricting. And we have a shot of taking back one United States Senate position from John Cornyn, which would be the first Democratic senator, would be MJ Hagar, first one in 30 years. So we could have a watershed election night here in Texas.
I was really amused by you and Senator Booker. You guys were out there hustling hard for MJ, trying to raise some cash.
We were. We had a group text going on and everything. Oh, we need to juice this up a little bit to get it. I don't know if we're going to make it, but I think yesterday it was like $301,000, and really the credit belongs to Chris Murphy, Cory Booker, and Brian Schatz, the senators engage in that for different candidates across the country, and they asked if I would participate in the Texas one, which I was happy to do.
We are all experiencing this pandemic in different ways. And I know you, for example, are dealing with the fact that like you're in dad mode and your kids have online classes. And you and I both know that we're the luckiest, right? Like we have a roof over our heads, we have food in our refrigerator. We're crystal clear about the fact that even the challenges that we're going through pale in comparison to what most Americans are going through right now. And I think a lot, especially about kids in our communities who just either don't have access to broadband, don't have the tools that they need in order to access these classes online, very often have parents who are essential workers and aren't there to sit with them and help them get through the mechanics of these things that you and I can attest are complicated for adults. There's going to be a gap on the other side of this that I am not certain how we address.
You're right. I mean, I can tell just, I am managing my kids' virtual learning these days. Stay-at-home dad. Yeah, no, I mean, it's been fun, but it's also a scramble because for the schools, the teachers, for the parents, for the students, such a different experience for most students. And I've told, my wife Erica on a couple of occasions, just what you said. I mean, I know how fortunate we are that I can't imagine how some of these parents are dealing with this if they lack the technology, the devices, and even if they have that, if they don't have a background in these, the Zoom app and Seesaw and any number of other apps and staying on top of it. And then if they have to work themselves and they're taking the kid over to their grandparents' house or to a neighbor's house, I really believe two things about that. It's putting a lot of stress on families who are already stressed. And then secondly, that I think the kids are at most getting, 60% of the learning experience. I don't think that they're getting nearly as much out of it as we would hope. At least that's my firsthand impression of all of it. And it's not because anybody's doing it wrong. It's because of the limitations of this system. And also for some families, because our system, our larger system, has failed them.
I want to ask you one more policy question before I let you go, which is about the protests that we've been seeing across this country. Of course, the most recent protests tied to, the Breonna Taylor case. I think of you as being someone who is both incredibly optimistic and idealistic, but also very practical. And so I wonder, as you see protesters come forward, with the list of demands, what you think is within the realm of possibility to actually get done when it comes to police reform and justice reform.
Well, I was happy that at the federal level in DC, House of Representatives passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that had a lot of important provisions in it, from banning chokeholds and strangleholds to greater accountability and transparency in terms of police officer discipline, to beginning to demilitarize our police, to limiting qualified immunity. Now, that's landed with a thud, like so many other things, on the doorstep of Mitch McConnell's Senate, and it's not going anywhere, but that could change next year. The good news is, though, to answer your question about what's possible, in local community after local community, there's an opportunity to put measures in place like those and others to actually make a difference in curtailing excessive force and the disparate treatment of Black Americans and other people of color throughout the United States. So my advice would be, this is a time when people should focus at a local level on those police union contracts, on budgets, on policies that are in place regarding transparency and discipline, where you actually can change the culture over time of the police department, so that just because somebody is a Black man, they're not more likely to be stopped or be treated to excessive force by police officers. People have the power to actually change things at the local level. I saw that firsthand.
Final question. You see the countdown clock, so you know how much time we have, which is, I know you're very busy with your podcast. It is truly excellent. I love it. Anyone who is not already subscribed to it, please subscribe to it. You have your pack. You are, as you said, dadding right now. So it is a busy time. And yet I suspect that you are not done with your time in public service, and you are not done running for things. So what is next for you?
It's a good question, Alicia. I'm not sure. I'm at a point where I'm not aiming for any particular office, and I'm enjoying supporting other candidates right now. I also, I'm looking forward to Donald Trump being out of office, because I think that, at least for me, the hardest thing to do on the campaign trail last year was to smile. There was a poll that I think has been cast over so many people that made it harder to be as optimistic as possible, or even as I wanted to be in the campaign. And so I think that, hopefully, this is just talking about my future. If I do run again, it's going to be at a moment in our country's history where, we're actually looking upward again, and we're able to dream again. Because under this guy, that hasn't been the case. We've been reacting and so forth.
All right, Secretary Castro, thank you so much. So nice to spend this time together.
Good to be with you.